solutions. So since I said real problems, real solutions, that must mean that I have some things that I consider non-problems, and then say what I think is a real problem, and then the non-solution according to my perspective, and then I want presume to know the definitive solution, so possible solutions. So the non-problem, just to get out of the way, is that so this is, I'm just putting this up because there have been lots of talks about this in this seminar series. If you look at the picture on the left, you see the notorious hairpins, paper clips, and the problem. This is, indicative of this discussion about superintelligence and issues that arise from that. So to me, that is a non-problem at the moment, but we have respectful disagreements there with the organizer of the seminar, but maybe we could leave that for discussion in another seminar, which hopefully we will organize in the near future with some international experts. So that would be an.
Yes.
I'm sorry?
I look forward to that.
Yeah, so we can continue that discussion on another occasion. So what is the problem according to what I'm going to talk about today? So I'm just going to illustrate that with a number of examples. So let's look at this example now from several years ago, and people might have already forgotten about it, but this is where it all really started to get into the public discussion and imagination. This was the notorious Cambridge Analytica expose, where it was revealed that Facebook was sharing a lot of this information about users with this private company based in Cambridge, UK, and they were doing all kinds of things with that. So that took off into public debate, and there was a major scandal, and eventually the Mark Zuckerberg was called to a hearing at the US Congress, etc. And of course, Cambridge Analytica went out of business. But if that this particular episode has receded from public memory, we got just before the summer another example that hit the headlines once again, and this was the Uber files. And there was a leak of another whistleblower who leaked 124,000 internal documents to Guardian, and it laid bare a number of extremely questionable practices that the company had followed in Europe and also around the world, which again, led to renewal of this kind of discussion about what big tech is doing with data and other questionable practices. Another example illustrating all of this is the Nobel Peace Prize lecture by Maria Ressa, and she's a journalist from the third world, from the Philippines, and she really has to face this danger in real life, in pretty dangerous situations there in the Philippines with the politics and so on. And so she talked from her personal experience about this deadly game for power and money, and how surveillance capitalism, which is a word that will come up repeatedly today, extracts private life for outside corporate gain, and how these highly profitable micro-targeting operations are engineered to structurally undermine human will, etc. And all this is carried out with the profit-driven machines at scale, with cheap armies on social media tearing down democracy. So this is an experience from the Philippines, but I can add that similar things happen in other places around the world. In particular, in India, this is also a major problem today. So this is a real issue, not only in the Philippines, but around the world. So this was also the topic of a book that was published a few years ago by Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard, and she called it The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And that was the word used by Maria Ressa as well. And the book is all about how these big data companies are extracting data from users and doing all kinds of things with it in ways that do not have consent from users. And another very recent article that I recommend to all of you to read, which makes for very, very disturbing reading, is by Zephyr Teachout in a recent issue of the New York Review of Books. And she talks also about how there's this overwhelming surveillance machinery in place all over. And so this picture shows how truck drivers who are operating these trucks for various logistic companies have every second of their activity recorded and used in ways which really make a hell of their life. So this reading this article it really makes for very disturbing reading about how the surveillance machinery is used by these companies and what it does to the lives of people. Now it turns out that recently this has also, and I mean, there've been possibly it has entered fiction, and sometimes it's very hard to distinguish what is fiction and what is real life. So there are these two recent novels by Dave Eggers, who lives in the Silicon Valley, and saw this, from a ringside seat. So a few years back, he published The Circle, which was a very thinly veiled parable about a certain company that we use for search engine search results. And then he thought that he was done with the book, but then it turned out that it was only the beginning. And then he came out with another book, which was just published a few years back, called The Every, which shows this dystopia in ever starker light. So he was influenced by this book, Surveillance Capitalism, but he also saw it in his interactions in everyday life on the West Coast. And as I said, sometimes it's very hard to really see what is fiction. I mean, something that he tries to paint in a particularly novelistic way, but actually sometimes it's so close to real life that it's very hard to distinguish the two. Here is another example from the Boston Review last year. And this was a forum that started with a lead article by the MIT economist Daron Acemoglu. And so the title of his piece said, AI's future does not have to be dystopian. And so while he recognizes all the amazing things that AI technologies have done, which we all are familiar with, he also recognized or he indicated that there are dangers about, from his point of view as an economist, about the future of jobs, that it automates work to an excessive degree, and in the process, it might undermine democracy and individual freedoms. So this was also a very nice discussion forum, which he initiated with his article, and then he had responses from a number of other people, and he also came back with a summary and responses to all of them. So this was talking about another aspect of AI and its impact on the world, which is about its effect on jobs. Is another very important theme. So a lot of this is summarized in this book by Kate Crawford a few years back, called The Atlas of AI, and she has chapters that talk about many of these issues at bigger length. So those of you who want more details and so on, I can recommend taking a look at her book. So how do we respond to this? So in response to this, of course, people, one of the things that has cropped up a lot in debate all over the place are various kinds of calls for ethics, AI ethics. And so there are just a few examples. So one of the best known ones perhaps is the Vatican AI principles, known as the Rome Call for AI Ethics, which is championed by this person in the picture there, whose name I forget, but he's the one of the top advisors to the Pope, and he's responsible for this particular initiative. And then you see on the picture that he also has some top leaders of major corporations that are part of this Rome Call for AI Ethics. So it looks like a very wonderful collaboration between society, public actors in society, leader of a major religion around the world, etc., and engaging in a nice dialogue and discussion, etc. And there are many other such calls: Beijing AI principles, DeepMind's ethics principles, etc., and our own Chalmers AI ethics principles. So apparently, according to some count, there's a list of such AI principles at AI ethicists stretching to over 80 entries, and more are constantly being added. So is this a good response to these problems that we saw on these on the first set of slides? And my take on this is that while this may be very well intentioned, it's completely misguided and in fact can be positively harmful. And that's what I want to make a case for now. So reasons to see why the call is all these calls for AI ethics are misguided. Let's look at the testimony to the US Congress by Frances Horgan when she acted as whistleblower for Facebook and released a lot of internal documents. And what it shows when you look at those documents very clearly is that Facebook executives were perfectly aware of what the impact of their policies and actions were doing on the public. It was not that they did not know what was happening. It was not that they didn't know what the effect was on various people, especially, for example, vulnerable groups like young girls, etc. They were perfectly aware of that and the harm they were causing, but they could have done things to change that, but they actually perfectly consciously made a decision not to do that. And the reason was because they found it more profitable to do it, not to do anything. So they put, as she put it, as their astronomical profits before people. So it was not that they needed a lecture or a course on AI ethics to realize what was happening and that they would become wiser after taking a course on AI ethics and change anything. So they were perfectly aware of what was happening and what harm they were causing. And the same thing you see in the Uber files. And so those documents clearly show that they had a very deliberate approach to break the law, to change the law, and to do everything that subverted the legal system. So once again, it was not that they were unaware of it, and so therefore they needed a course on AI ethics or ethics principles to change what was happening. They knew it perfectly well, and it was a well thought out, deliberate business strategy to do what they were doing. They were deliberately breaking the law. It was not that they didn't know that they deliberately wanted to break and change the law. And so this term ethics washing has been used to describe this, because here's an example that so Google developed or had internally what they had an internal unit called the Artificial Intelligence Ethics in AI Research Unit, and they had this very high-profile women scientists, Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, who were leading this unit. And so that was supposed to show that they took AI ethics and all these things very seriously, but actually the behavior showed that it was exactly the opposite, because first of all, when this unit wanted to publish a paper that was demonstrating harmful effects of some of the technologies, they wanted them to withdraw the paper, not to have it published. And when they refused to do that, the action was very swift. So they terminated her with hardly any fuss, in the most abrupt fashion possible. So, and so this whole ethics in AI unit was completely disbanded and was done in a very abrupt fashion, with hardly any respect shown to any of those people who were involved in this team. And just recently, a few days back, we discovered that Meta also did exactly the same thing. So they dissolved the team responsible for discovering potential harms to society in its AI, in its own products. So all these are examples that show that these AI ethics principles are either completely meaningless, or they're isolated, or they're completely toothless. So these three things are made more, so there's a longer description of what this means and why you use those terms by Luke Moon in an article which he calls The Uselessness of AI Ethics. And in fact, as I said, it's not only that they're meaningless and toothless and useless, but in fact, it's very counterproductive and positively harmful. And that is something that's brought out more at length in this article by Elettra Beatri called From Ethics Washing to Ethics Bashing. So all this talk about AI ethics and these research units internally, etc., they're a way of simply, yes, so we can just go to exactly what was said in so many words, said it much better by Thomas Metzinger, who is a professor in theoretical philosophy at Mainz, and he has been on the European Commission's expert group on ethics, trying to formulate, part of these EU guidelines on ethics. And he concluded that at the end of it, that this is really just a case of ethics washing, namely industry organizes and cultivates these kinds of ethical debates, but the only reason they want to do this is to buy time and distract the public and prevent or delay effective regulation and policy making. So, and another interesting fact there is, of these 52 experts who were involved by the European Commission in drafting this document, 23 of them came from companies like Nokia, Google, Airbus, IBM, etc. So you have, and if you include some lobbying associations, then there are 26 representatives from industry. So there's a huge push from the industry to formulate such ethics guidelines. And from his own experience directly participating in it, the main purpose of all of those was simply to prevent or delay effective regulation and policy making. And so this is the sense in which ethics, this kind of ethics discussion, ethics washing, is in fact not only meaningless and toothless, but actually is positively harmful, because it's delaying and preventing action that needs to be taken. So why is this the case? Well, it's a very simple insight that was said very memorably by Milton Friedman. You won't find me quoting Milton Friedman too often, but here is an example where I do agree with him, that when you talk about social responsibility of business, there is only one social responsibility, and that is to engage in activities designed to increase its profits. So it's the whole discussion about AI ethics is something that companies and corporations should formulate and take part in, etc. It's some kind of oxymoron. I mean, they completely misses the point that there is no other social responsibility of business from its point of view than to make profits. So anything that comes in the way of making profits is going to be put to the side. And this is what we have seen in these examples from Facebook, Uber, etc. This is exactly what we saw playing out. And so this is advertising our own article in the Guardian last year, where among many things we made exactly this point, that it's a very simple error, a mistake to think that companies should engage in or that they should be expected to engage in formulating AI ethics, etc., that prioritize the social benefit, because any company that does this and prioritize the social benefit over profit will quickly cease to exist. So just recognizing so this is not a left wing or a Marxist or whatever point of view. This is just following the logic of the market. Any company, especially very big tech companies like Meta and Amazon and Google, etc., these companies that we're talking about in this discussion, if they attempt to, if they did anything other than prioritize profit, and in fact actually did something which went against their profit making because it was going to be for social benefit, that would be completely against their business priorities, their business logic. And so it's no surprise that all of this talk of AI ethics, etc., here from these big corporations is simply public relations maneuver that's intended to head off regulation. It's just a very simple point that one has to recognize before making, thinking about the problem of what one should do. So there's a lot of this discussion about AI ethics and so on, which is, in this sense, it's quite misguided, because there is absolutely no point in having those discussions. It simply delays the effective action that needs to be taken. So what is the real problem? So the real problem, again, just to state this very explicitly, that we are all aware of, is the enormous power that all these big tech companies wield over the economy and society. So these are just a few illustrative figures that Google's total revenues are as high as whole countries. Fourth of the population today is on one of these social platforms of Meta, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger. Amazon today carries about 50-70% of the US online marketplace. And as was recognized by a report by the US House Judiciary Committee, 30% of the world's gross economic output actually lies within these firms and just a handful of others right now. So this is really the real problem, this intense concentration of power and dominance among these companies that then leads to all these other actions, all these other consequences that we saw on the initial deck that plays out not that is not beneficial, but in fact positively harmful to society. So this is a very nice book based on the Tanner lectures on human values delivered at Princeton a few years back in around 2017 by the noted philosopher Elizabeth Anderson. And so she put this very starkly when she said that the behavior of many of these corporations is like a private government, and many workers in the United States, they essentially live as if they're governed by communist dictatorships in their everyday lives. And she could have made this argument even stronger. She makes this more generally about companies and corporations in the US, but she could have made this case even more stronger. The mother of such dictatorships are these big tech corporations. It's absolutely starkest and strongest when you look at how these big tech corporations behave. This comes out most starkly in these cases. So what is what means do we have to challenge this? This is again quoting from this article that we wrote about it, that it's the most basic tools, the essential tools are actually legislation, regulatory agencies. These have been the tools that are the most important, and we call it it said there are the only effective means that democratic societies have at their disposal for protecting the public from the undesirable effects of corporate power. So why have these such legislation and regulatory actions not been taken? So the fact that this is how one should go has been made by other people as well. So just to quote two other people who are very influential, Cory Doctorow, who is a very well-known digital rights activist, and he has this book, a small booklet called "How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism" that he bases on. So it's a response to Susanna Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism, and so his basic point is exactly the same: that we need to fix the internet, we need to have digital rights activism. And again, Zephyr Teachout who was the person I mentioned in one of the first slides. So she's a professor of law, but she was also the Democratic nominee she was a Democratic nominee to be the Attorney General of New York. I think she lost that that election, but she makes the claim that in fact pro-labor and antitrust laws are needed more than ever before, and that these are a very basic tool for democracy protection. Now, before we go into what these regulatory actions can be and should be, etc., there's one argument that sometimes is made quite often that such regulation is going to be a hindrance to innovation. And this is a point that we addressed in our Guardian article as well. This is completely without merit. And just to give examples, if government regulations, they have not prevented these dramatic bioengineering advances that we have seen very recently. For example, in COVID vaccines, they didn't stop innovation in car companies to make electric vehicles, etc. So we have seen regulatory activities in many different sectors of technology, and they have not prevented dramatic advances. So why would one expect that it's only AI and big tech that is very special and they should be affected by regulation? So in fact, as this another recent book argues, regulation is an ally of authentic innovation because it levels the playing field between competitors, it prevents the abuse of dominant positions, enables daring experiments, protects the results, etc. So, in a way, regulation and regulatory procedures they're not only are they not inimical to innovation, they're actually its main ally. So it should be seen as one of the main allies of authentic innovation. And not having regulation is actually very detrimental to innovation, such as we've seen with these big tech corporations, when they're allowed to impose their dominance and swallow up other competitors. That's exactly going in, that's exactly what is inimical to innovation. So this argument that regulation, etc., stands in the way of innovation is completely without merit. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. So here's a brief history of such regulation. So if you start in the United States, where all these problems are the most acute, it might, if one doesn't know about it, as I didn't, it's surprising, or it's interesting to see that this was one of the main. It was a very strongly felt position in the U.S. from its origin. So Louis Brandeis, who was a justice of the Supreme Court, 1916 to 39, he was very exercised about this, and so right in those early days, it was very important in the United States, especially that they should prevent these kinds of dominant positions. So he said memorably that we may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. And so a very nice short summary history of this is provided by Tim Wu in his book, The Curse of Bigness. So actually, the history of the United States is littered with many such regulatory actions that prevented such concentrations of power. So there was the Sherman Act in 1890 to avoid price fixing cartels, and it was used to break up Standard Oil in 1911. Then there was the Clayton Act in 1914 that restricted mergers and acquisitions. And there was the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 preventing unfair competitions. So if either of any of these actions had been in force today, you would not have had the kind of mergers and acquisitions that we have seen with big tech that Google, Meta, Facebook, Amazon, etc. have done recently. They simply would not have occurred. And so another example of legislation here is the breakup of AT&T from 1970 to 82. So this was an example where a big conglomerate like this was actually broken up. And these historical examples show that applying these regulations simply would not have allowed the kind of mega big tech companies that we have today. And the reason that we do have them today is because this tradition was broken around the 1980s. From the time that Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, in particular, the Chicago School interpretation of antitrust took over, which was pioneered by Robert Bork, who was Reagan's nominee to be on the Supreme Court, but failed. And so they reinterpreted all these existing laws in a very narrow way to focus only on consumer prices. And very significantly weakened antitrust. And this is the reason why this has led to the situation we are in today. And in fact, this whole thing has to be looked at again. And there is a nice paper here by Elettra Bietri, who I quoted also in the previous slide, talking about the need to reconsider all of these antitrust legislation in the era of big tech and so-called self-regulating platforms. And there is some hope here because there is now a movement in the US called the Neo-Brandeis movement. So this is going back to Justice Brandeis, and two very significant appointees by the Biden administration by Lina Khan to be the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, and Tim Wu as the Technology and Competition Policy Advisor. So these are two people. So Tim Wu, I mentioned, is with author of the book The Curse of Bigness, and Lina Khan is a very strong advocate of antitrust. So these are a few quotes from Lina Khan. So she has written very extensively on this, and she says, for example, there's a growing recognition that the way the economy has been structured has not always been to serve people, and so she's a very strong advocate of antitrust legislation, and taking her inspiration from Justice Brandeis. And so these are hopeful signs that things may be changing in the US, but unfortunately, this has not actually resulted in any significant new legislation to change the course of things. So just recently, there was news of a possible new introduction of a new act in Congress, which has been stymied. So while there is a lot of hope in these new appointments, nothing actually concrete has yet come out in the US. Now, on the European front, actually, there's been some significant developments too. So this is going in large part due to the enthusiastic actions of Margrethe Vestager, who is a Danish politician from the Liberal Party. And so she's been very instrumental in pushing this. So she's been very, very big. She has challenged many of these big tech companies in the European market. She's been instrumental in leveling big penalties on Google, Apple, etc., which has been in the news. And she's been driving force in these new directives, legislation that is being discussed currently, the European Digital Services Act and the European Digital Market Act. So as it summarizes there, they recognize that these few big tech companies, they've been acting as gatekeepers in digital markets with the power of private rule makers, and that you need a modern legal framework to address this issue. So all of this activism from her has earned her the wrath of many people, in particular Donald Trump, who labeled her the person who hates the United States more than any other person I've met. And of course, like many other Trumpisms, that's very funny, because in what sense does she hate the United States except in actually pushing for the foundational principles from the original constitutions of the US. So it's only in the sense that she has actually pushed for liberal principles, that are the foundations of the United States. And it's only in that sense that she can be considered to hate the United States more than any other person. So some key points from the DSA. So they have, for example, suggestions that to have content liability and monitoring, new due diligence obligations, takedown notices, complaint handling, sanctions. So the largest platforms can be fined up to 6% of their annual revenue for violating rules around hate speech and illegal goods. The Digital Market Act has a ban on, for example, combining platform data with data from third parties, automatically logging users from one service to another. So exactly these kinds of activities, that illegal activities we saw on the very first slides, that, for example, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica had done. So again, to let businesses on platform offer services and pricing that directly competes with the platform owner. This is, for example, to prevent Amazon from doing what it does. A requirement on platforms to reveal how their ads services work and exposing how much advertisers have paid, how much publishers receive for ads. So to make all those kinds of things very transparent. So these are well thought of points, and again, hopeful, but these have not yet come into force. And there have been lots of criticism. For example, from here's a Czech member of the European Parliament, the Pirate Party. So he, for example, says that national governments favored the voices of digital giants over the support for fundamental rights of European citizens. So the governments favored the voices of digital giants over the rights and benefits of their own citizens. So, and internet rules need to be human-centric in the first place and not centered around digital giants. And he doesn't believe that these DSA and DMA are actually doing that enough. So, for example, some of those things that one could criticize about them, for example, they want these illegal content to be removed automatically, but then if that is done, it will not be do that with the human. It will not be done possible to do that with the human moderator, and that means more automated filtering, and that's just playing into the hands of these digital giants. And for example, these kinds of things that they're suggesting, they again would allow a few American firms, giant tech firms, to control huge swathes of Europeans' online speech. Because at the moment, if it's done in this automatic way, then it's only these big giants who have the technical infrastructure and the technical wherewithal to do it. So there are some of this criticism shows that in formulating the draft of these two acts, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, it would have been better if the European Union had engaged in more consultation and discussion with technology experts. So this particular way that they've chosen to do it seems to indicate that they were not fully informed of exactly what the consequences are of doing things in this particular way. They could have benefited by having a better dialogue with AI technology experts. Now, another problem with all of this is, of course, as the Uber files revealed, that, and was just indicated also by this quote by the Czech parliamentarian, that there is corruption at the heart of Europe. So the Uber files revealed that, in fact, very top people both in the European Commission as well as in national governments, and two names that were mentioned explicitly there: Nelly Cruz, the former European Commissioner and Dutch Transportation Minister, and Emmanuel Macron, the French Prime Minister. They're revealed to have had secret negotiations, discussions with Uber, things which show very strong conflicts of interest. So there is corruption at the very heart of Europe in all of this. So regulation and antitrust and all of those things are all there, but they're all subject to the fact that the power and dominance of these corporations extends also within political establishments. So regulation and using legislation like antitrust is a very important first step, but in fact, it needs to be taken much further. As Tim Berners-Lee, who was, of course, one of the founding father of the internet, said in his Turing Award lecture 2016 that in today's society, in fact, access to the internet, the internet access and so on, should be seen as a basic right, like akin to how electricity was seen in the last century. So this is something that is absolutely fundamental and essential for every citizen to participate in the democratic process today. It's like a fundamental right that you absolutely cannot do without. And so if this is, if information infrastructure is so fundamental to democracy, then you need to change how the internet is owned and organized, as is argued by Ben Tarnoff in this book called The Internet for the People. So it's not just a case of making markets work better, which is how you would do it using legislation and antitrust, etc. But in fact, you should make them less dominant. So this information infrastructure should be seen as something which is an essential public good, and not necessarily as a market, and should not be seen as a market provide something that is subjected to the market. I mean, it's well recognized that even in market societies, which have many benefits that everybody knows about and is hardly challenged, there are some areas which are recognized to be areas that one should be careful about letting it be market driven. So there are well-known cases where they're considered, the economists have a term for that, they're considered market failures. So the US healthcare sector, for example, is very well-known example that is discussed as a market failure. And I think what we have seen in these big tech, the case of big tech in information infrastructure should be seen as a very giant case of market failure. So if you look at it this way, then information infrastructure should be also something that is taken more and more away out of the market purview and provided as a basic good to citizens in a democracy. So a good case can be made that if you want to direct AI and big tech for social goods, then government regulation, leadership is necessary. Markets cannot do it. Transparency, democratic discourse, and accountability is necessary. And as Acemoglu said in his Boston Review lead article, a massive redirection is needed in technological change, especially in AI, and that this cannot be led by today's corporate giants because their profit incentives and business models have centered on things like automation and monitoring, which are profitable to them, but not beneficial or positively harmful to society and economy at large. And so this leads me to my final point, which is that when you see it in this way, then universities can be seen as places which should take a lot of this leadership role. And it's very important in many ways. So Acemoglu and Restrepo make an argument that in the current domination that these tech giants exert, also in the universities, people, the best minds start gravitating towards a particular type of AI machine learning with a heavy emphasis on automation that is actually not beneficial and again harmful to society at large. So if you want to bring AI and machine learning for the common good, then maybe one needs to go back to the classical ideals of a university. This is a point that I try to make in a recent forthcoming article in the CSEM call with the title, Can Universities Combat the Wrong Kind of AI? So the difference between the university and a public corporation is that universities have no such, or should not have any such private and profit motive as their immediate goal. And they're actually places where, in the classical ideals, they are places which strive for pure knowledge, not with increase of wealth, with things which are for the social good, for wider benefit of society. Those are things that are what the university was classically meant for. And in contrast to Silicon Valley titans who want to move fast and break things, the university spirit is more to move slow and build, and to build up fundamental knowledge and things which are of more widespread benefit for the society and economy at large. And so perhaps this is time for the universities, people like us, to take a bigger role. And in particular, for example, in these draft legislation coming out from the European Union, that there is, universities and research, independent researchers from universities who have a bigger role in shaping those legislations than corporations, as has currently seems to be the pattern. That's my talk. So, in summary, just to conclude, I try to argue that AI or other kinds of ethics is a somewhat misguided approach. It may be well-intentioned, but actually is either meaningless or in fact positively harmful, because it delays. It's actually used as a way to delay what is actually needed, which is to use tools like legal tools and regulation to reduce the power and domination of big tech. So stronger regulation is needed, for example, to break up these large big tech corporations using antitrust legal frameworks which are available but which have not been used forcefully enough, and that information infrastructure should be deprivatized so that it's for the public good, and that universities can play a key role in making this happen. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Devdatt.
Very inspiring presentation. Let us give him a round of applause before we take up the Q&A session.
Thank you, Devdatt, especially
for giving this talk, which I think picks up beautifully on recurrent thread in this AI ethics seminar, which is the criticism of AI ethics in itself. And I want to draw the audience's attention to some of the talks we have uploaded on the chair YouTube page, especially the Kuvadi's AI ethics seminar from June 2021, where we had several talks of great relevance to what you've been talking about here. So Mohammed Abdallah from Toronto talked about the influence that big tech has on academic AI research and compares this to big tobacco. There was also a more concrete discussion by Marcus Anderjung from Oxford talking about the experiment at NeurIPS with requiring ethical stances from all the submissions and the possible problems with that. So I'm going to open the floor now, as I said, to questions from the audience. I'm sure there are many, but maybe Peter wants to start, who raised a question in the chat. Do you want to turn on your mic and ask?
Yeah, okay, I can just, so I think, Dev, that he took up this issue, right? That, I mean, I think it is an issue that when you have regulation, you always have the danger that the corporations basically buy up the politicians. And you mentioned that there is a lot of corruption. I think that's pretty clear. I actually agree with you that sort of maybe that requires stronger kind of regulation, that actually these big corporations have to be split up. You need stronger antitrust laws. But another thing, so you mentioned this woman, Westhager, whatever her name is. So I haven't heard of her before, but yeah, I just thought I'd mention like that. I think so this desire to have stronger regulation or stronger antitrust laws in the US it's not a partisan issue as far as I can tell. There are people on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, who are pushing for this. And for example, on the Republican side, I think the person who is best known is Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri. But I think the problem is that like most of the politicians on both sides are basically in the pockets of the big corporations. This is the way the system works. So yeah, I mean, just what do you think can be done about that issue, or if anything?
Well, I mean, that's a very big major problem and a big issue. Now, in the United States, I thought it's a bipartisan support that prevents antitrust. In fact, the two establishment parties in both Republic. No, they prevent. I thought you said that they're in favor of antitrust. They're actually
no, I mean, on both sides of the issue, right? There are people on both sides who want stronger antitrust laws, but then the majority of politicians on both sides are preventing it.
Yeah, so I think I agree that the establishment politicians on both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, both of them are very guilty of being are guilty of not pushing of being in the pockets of corporations and not pushing the antitrust agenda that they do, that the tools that they do have, as I mentioned, that are available within the U.S. legislation. I mean, in terms of people who are antitrust, advocates, I think I would disagree with you in thinking that the best example for this is Josh Hawley. For me, the best examples of these are people like Lina Khan, who I mentioned is the FTC chair. So she's a very strong, very articulate advocate of using antitrust. And on the political side, Zephyr Teachout, she's been in, I think she ran for Congress. She was defeated in the elections, but so she's part of she's been associated with the political campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And in those campaigns, there's a very strong, explicit agenda for antitrust. So both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they are very strong advocates, very strong voices against antitrust. So there, I mean, I see that as the hopeful future in the U.S. With Josh Hawley type of Republican, libertarian, so on. I'm not so sure, but I'm not seeing. I haven't seen the things that he proposes for antitrust, and so I can't comment on that directly. But
thank you, Devdatt. Can you take down the slides
so we can all see each other during the Q&A?
Oh, sorry, I thought I'd. Yeah,
and in the meantime, Gerardo has a question.
Thanks for the talk, Devdatt. I think it was very nice. My question is now related to the connection between, in your talk, you present a lot of very interesting books and articles, and many of them I would more classify towards privacy than towards AI or ethics. And of course, there is an overlap in there. Do I understand correctly that in certain sense, because I agree with this idea of regulation, I also agree that indeed we cannot expect that this comes from companies because their main aim is to make money. I completely agree with that. So do you expect to have something on AI along the lines of the GDPR, some kind of strong regulations that are imposed and controlled or monitored by governmental companies? Is that what you aim at, or what is exactly? It's a question of naming also, because when you say AI ethic is useless or not important, maybe it's a question of understanding that you mean AI by expecting that the companies take the initiative is an idealistic view.
No, I mean, I think the discussion, I mean, focusing on AI ethics principles and making, very abstract discussions of ethics, as I said, is I try to argue that that's meaningless, toothless, but also it's positively harmful because it's simply used as a way to prevent effective legislation. And legislation that the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, they are precisely intended to tackle this problem of the dominance of these AI big tech companies. So they are very focused on restricting the activities of these, or trying to correct for the misuse of their dominance and market power that the AI and big tech companies exercise. Now, they are not necessarily, as I said, there is a lot of scope for improving that legislation. And actually, the example of GDPR is one that I think one can be very critical of GDPR. It's an example of something which, again, perhaps had good intentions, but what it effectively ends up doing is that on the one hand, it, to carry out these kinds of GDPR requirements is very onerous, and so the smaller the companies are, for small and medium-sized companies, it imposes a huge onerous responsibility. Whereas these bigger corporations, they are better equipped to deal with it both legalistically and as well as having bigger information infrastructure. So in this sense, I think GDPR is another example where it's not necessarily the right way to have done it to address the problems that were occurring. And again, they could have done a better job if they had consulted more with AI technology, big data technology researchers and people who are more familiar with AI technology in general to make it more effective. Because otherwise, the way it has been implemented seems to be more onerous on small companies and lets the big ones get away with it as usual. So.
Then yeah, I agree with that. But what could be then the right approach? Do you have examples of regulations on AI ethics that could be good effect and not the bad effects that you mentioned exactly with the GDPR? What would be a good example of the
very first? I think a very first step, which I said, very basic first step, should have been what they did which they did in the past with Standard Oil and AT&T. AT&T is a very good example. I mean, they broke up AT&T because you had exactly all these problems about dominance and the competition and everything that you talk about. In what is supposed to be a well-functioning market economy is exactly what was not being done when you have these concentration of power. And so they broke up AT&T. That's exactly what they did, and that's exactly what they should do now. There is absolutely no reason. It goes against all the tenets of market competition to allow Amazon to have the kind of dominance it has on multiple roles. It plays this role of a platform, but at the same time, it's running logistics, warehouses. It puts up other people's things to sell on their platform, but uses its power to promote its own products, and in the meanwhile gets information and data from the other people, etc. So it's absolutely fundamental that first of all you need to break up these megaliths, and that's absolutely fundamental before anything else is done. Unless you break up, use antitrust. These tools are available. Use the antitrust to break up these big corporations. That's the very first step.
Thank you. Do we have
further questions or comments from the audience?
Let me
ask a question then. So at one point, Devdatt, you talked about how you favor regulation, which I do as well, but you made a point of regulation not harming innovation. And I think that regulation absolutely has the potential to selectively harm innovation. And I think that's a good thing, because there are areas where we want to speed up innovation, and there are maybe other areas that we want to slow down. And a real example here, I think, which is kind of obvious, is that regulation against cloning and genetic editing of humans has really slowed down work in that area. That's a real harm, if you want to use that word, on innovation rates in a field due to regulation.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, I don't know if one would describe it as harming innovation. I mean, it has stopped, that particular example, it has stopped the wrong harmful, morally objectionable uses of that technology in various ways. For example, in cloning and editing somatic, using genetic engineering for birth purposes, etc., especially humans. So it has stopped the use of those technologies in those areas, but that regulation has not stopped innovation in genetic engineering itself. I mean, CRISPR, Cas9 technologies, and those are being innovated at great speed. There are other issues there with the patent fight between Berkeley and MIT, etc. But I think regulation there, again, it has not stopped the innovation and research and innovation in genetic technologies, but has been used to stop its use in potentially harmful or morally objectionable ways.
Okay. Further questions? Well, we are
just about out of time. Oh, here we have something in the chat from Lars. Do you want to speak up? Lars Eklund.
Yeah, I mean, I get the point that you may need to have a discussion on ethics in order to formulate these regulations, etc. And yes, of course, if you're doing it in that way, yeah, I would hardly object to that. But the objection came up because of the way that has been done, it has been used. So if you do it in this way, which is toothless, meaningless, and so on, etc., then and it's simply used as a way to delay regulation. That was the objection. So if it's used as a way to inform the formulation of regulations, etc., yes, I mean, it has its value there. I don't deny that. But in general, yes, I don't think that, it depends on what you mean by ethics and ethics discussions. I mean, if they get, you start going off into arcane puzzles or the trolley problem, etc., etc., I don't think those are at all meaningful and useful in formulating regulations.
all right. With that,
I'm closing this session. Let's give Devdatt one more round of applause, and thank you also to everyone in the audience who participated. I'm turning off the recording